Hey, my name's Johnson. When I was growing up, my dad was a Presbyterian pastor, so we moved around a decent amount. So we landed in like Kentucky and the mountains of Tennessee and Texas and the mountains of North Carolina. And then by God's infinite grace and mercy, I landed in Athens, Georgia at God's College, the University of Georgia. Maybe this is the year. Come on, sick 'em. And in 1999, my wife Summer and I, we actually landed at this church called Victory World Church, just right down the street in Norcross. And within the first 5 minutes of walking inside this building, I had this stunning realization that I was white. I don't know if y'all picked that up. I'm a white dude. And I walked into this sea of Mexicans and Australians and Ukrainians and Nigerians and Rwandans. And then I was just this white dude. And I'm like, I ain't ever been in anything like this before. In 1990, Victory began with a heart to be multicultural. And here we are 29 years later, 142 nations inside the church. And so I walk inside this setting, and I realized something very quickly, that I'd always been in white settings my entire life. I just never knew there was anything really other than that in white suburban settings. And I realized very quickly that when you're in the majority, you don't realize you're in the majority because everything caters to you. You've never had to really compromise anything. So I'm walking into this environment, and I'm introduced to all these people who don't look like me and talk like me and think like me and process like me, and they worship differently than I do, and the preachers are preaching differently than I've ever heard it before. But there's a part of me that's like, all right, there's a little bit of actual rhythm. Like, it's hard to have rhythm to an organ, at least the organs I grew up on. And what happened was, as I began to worship with people who are different than me, and go to small group with people who are different than me, and talk about life stories with people who are different than me, and have my kids grow up with people who are different than me, and actually become best friends with people who are different than me, something actually started changing in me. That those prejudices that I didn't even know were there were first brought up, and then God was able to actually heal them. It's really hard to heal things that are in the dark, and so sometimes you need to get in places that will shine light so God can heal those places. And this was taking place in my life, and I hadn't ever experienced anything as rich in this. And so here's what I can just confidently say, is that 20 years into this process of wanting to live a reconciled life, I can say that we are better together than we are apart. We are better and more beautiful and richer, and we're wiser and we're more godly together than we are separate. And I think here's what happens though, when we divide out, into our political lines and our homogeneous Sunday units, and along our petty squabbles and the skin color thing, is what happens is that we are the image of God. That's the idea of this, right? Like, I'm not the image of God, we are the image of God. And when we divide out along the multicultural lines, we rob culture of the beauty of God's diversity. Like, we are the image, and when they're only seeing a white image or a black image or a Latino or an Asian or a male or a female, when it's segregated out, they're not seeing the whole beauty of who God is. And that's why I believe in this. I mean, that's why we have to be reconciled. This is why I believe that it is a God mandate to know the story, own the story, and God help us to change the story. And we do believe this, okay? I believe this to my core, that it's only a reconciled church. It's the power lies inside the church to bring reconciliation to the world. Because I don't believe that God's going to let anybody else get the glory for it. It's going to have to be for his name through the church. And so this is a mandate. This is a mandate for us to do this, to pursue environments like this, and to let it echo outside this room right here. And so we believe this. We believe that if the story is going to change, if we're going to know the story, own the story, and then change the story, if the story's ever going to change, It begins with the people of God. So here's the big question, okay? What does it look like to change the story? We're all kind of having these short talks. I don't have my whole sermon time right now, so I want to give you just a few thoughts. What does it look like to actually begin changing the story? How can the church start changing the story? Here's the first one. The church that changes the story is the church that doesn't judge a book by its cover. It's the church that doesn't judge a book by its cover. I came across this. There was a shooting in Pittsburgh a few years ago, and get this, there was a white news anchor who reported this. Here's what she said. You needn't be a criminal profiler to draw a mental sketch of the killers. They are young black men, likely teens or in their early 20s. They have multiple siblings from multiple fathers, and their mothers work multiple jobs. These boys have been in the system before. They've grown up there. They know the police. They've been arrested. The problem was she said this before there were any suspects. And this is how the world works, right? We form judgments about people groups based on appearance, you know? This is the narrative that black people are thugs, white people are racist, Latinos are illegal, and Asians are bad drivers. You know, that old people are stuck in their ways, young people are entitled, right? You know, this is the narrative, and this is how the world operates, but it shouldn't be how the church operates. All right, 2 Corinthians 5:16, therefore from now on we regard no one according to the flesh. The worst injustice I could do to you is take a Polaroid picture of your skin color and the clothes you wear and think I've got you figured out. That's how the world does it. It can't be how the church does it. And a while ago, I sat down with some of our staff, and I confess that we were just kind of sharing life, and I said, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't realize this till later on, but I grew up very prejudiced against black people in particular, because I grew up watching the nightly news. And all I had ever seen, you know, during the war on drugs in the 80s, which I come to find out later is the war on black people in the 80s, and all you ever see on the nightly news is black killer, black rapist, black drug dealer, and that's what I grew up on every single night. And it wasn't until later that I realized that, hey, television tells a vision. And there are many false prophets in our land. And I'm sitting down with the staff, right? And then I have a Nigerian staff member. Here's what she says. She's like, yeah, when I came over from Nigeria to America, I was really prejudiced against black people too. And all the white people are like, but you're black. And she's like, I'm not black, I'm African. I don't know what that means. Like, help me, you know? But she was saying she grew up prejudiced because she watched the movies in Nigeria that America exports. And then the whole circle of black people in my staff said, yeah, I grew up prejudiced against black people too because we watch the news in my family too. And we just kind of have this moment where we all acknowledge we have never once on a consistent basis ever seen a positive image of a black culture in our entire lives. And I think what we have to do, acknowledging that there is a vision being told, what we have to do is we have to categorically reject the false prophets of media, of politics that want to pit us against each other, that there's something so much greater than that. We have to reject the false prophets and we have to embrace the message of Christ, right? Which is to love your neighbors, you love yourself. Don't try and clutter it up. No, just love each other. Could we actually embrace the golden rule, all right? Like to reject the false prophet, embrace the golden rule. It doesn't matter if your pants are sagging or you're waving a Confederate flag. I'm going to treat you the way that I want to be treated as a unique, made in God's image individual. I'm not going to silently judge you in my heart. I'm going to get into your story. I want to see Christ redeem your story, right? Like I want to love you. Why? Because we're better together than we are separate. That's what it looks like to change the story. What the church that changes the story second is the church that moves beyond toleration to reconciliation. You know, even being in a church like I'm at Victory with 142 nations, you realize very quickly that there are a lot of people who go to a multicultural church, but they're not reconciled themselves. And if the most multicultural environment you're in is on a Sunday, but you never do life with people outside of that environment, you're just tolerating each other. You're not actually reconciled to each other. And I think there's a deeper place called love that we could actually arrive in. You know, toleration, reconciliation. Toleration is like, I don't mind if other people eat different foods and, you know, speak different languages in their little setting. But, you know, here in America, that's not what we do. Like, you know, reconciliation is saying, I want to enter into that. Toleration is, I don't mind if some other people, you know, from other countries move to my neighborhood. Like, not too many can move to my neighborhood. Don't paint your house purple, like that sort of thing. Reconciliation is, I want you to come to my house, and I want to go to your house, and I want to get to know you. Toleration is, I don't mind if some other cultures come to my church. Just don't make it too black. Just don't make it too white. Right? You know, reconciliation is, we're better together than we are apart. I think some people are going to be really surprised when they get to heaven and they find out there's no like white section, right, with 400-year-old hymns. Praise Father, Son, and Holy. And there's no black section, right, where they got white people are like, I can't. Latinos like, te amo, Allah. Asians having a potluck after, you know, and like, we're just all gonna be there in the same space. Every nation, tribe, tongue, creed, white robes, worshiping Jesus. Because there's something bigger than all of our differences. There's a kingdom culture above our earthly culture. We value the earthly culture, but the kingdom culture is bigger, right? And we have to move beyond just putting up with each other to actually loving each other. That's how we're going to change the story. How else? The church that changes the story, let me talk to some leaders in the room, is the church that embraces leadership diversity. It's the church that embraces leadership diversity. You know, I'm all for visual diversity in our gatherings. I am. Like, I believe that it's a good thing maybe to have a leader over your greeters who's not in the majority culture. I believe it's good to have diversity on your worship platforms. But I was thinking about this week, is that our nation was actually built on rebellion against taxation without representation. But we do the same thing in many of our churches. We make decisions that impact other cultures without actually getting the other cultures inside the room. And so that's one of the things I've loved being involved in the staff there at Victory, is that we have a very diverse even executive team. And I love this. Very recently, like recent news, Waffle House, you know, a year plus ago, if y'all have your kind of ear to the ground on that, Waffle House had an incident go down in one of the restaurants where, you know, the report is still up in the air, but what it resulted in was a black woman being slammed onto the ground. She had probably come from a club. Her top comes down. White police officers are slamming a black woman down on the ground on the floor of a Waffle House. And what happens is there's this protest that's now being formed at the Waffle House national headquarters, which just so happens to share the same street with our church. And we have a multicultural church, and now we're about to have a protest going against the company that we bought our land from. And to complicate it even more, they're expecting several thousand people to come out. And to complicate it even more, we actually have a long-standing agreement with the Norcross Police Department, that's our city, that for any incident in the entire city limits, they can use our property as a center for response. And so they want to set up their riot tower in our parking lot, which, by the way, is actually about a 20-foot overlook on the Waffle House property. And so as a bunch of white guys in the room, at first, we're like, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to remain neutral. So what we're going to do, we have to honor the thing with the police so they can have our main parking lot. I know we have another parking lot with about another 1,000 spaces, but it's going to get too messy if we do that. And so we'll give waters to the police officers, and we'll give waters to we'll give porta potties to the police officers because we have to remain neutral. And there's another parking lot, about half a mile down the road that the protesters can park at. And then one of our black pastors is like, and he says, I understand how that might feel neutral until a news helicopter flies over and sees a completely empty main parking lot with about 50 police cars, a riot tower, and an empty 800 parking lot over here, and there's several thousand people walking from about a half mile down the road across traffic. And so it sparked this dialogue because we could actually have the dialogue. It wasn't just one or the other making a decision about the other, but we were in the room. And so what it turned into was what we deemed true neutrality. So whatever we do for one, we're going to do for the other. And so all of our pastors put on lanyards and shirts, and we were out there on that day. We were giving water to the police, and we were giving water to the protesters. And we're giving porta potties to the police, and we're giving porta potties to the protesters. And we're just trying to bring Christ's love into the midst of it. But that would have never gotten there if we didn't actually have diversity in our leadership representation. Last thought is this. The church that changes the story is the church that has grace when it comes to race. I was sitting in a setting, maybe a year or two ago. Billy was there, a handful of us were, and Reverend Warnock was there as well. And we were actually having a conversation on race. There's about 5 or 6 of us in the room as pastors. And Reverend Warnock just shared his heart, about racial reconciliation, about racism in America and things. And one of the white pastors in the room looks at him and just says, "You are so articulate." And the whole room goes, and there's this thing like, "You just told the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church that he's articulate. You can't do that, dude." And so there's this like, what's about to happen in the room? Like, it's about to go out. Like, we're pulling our phones out. And Reverend Warnock looks at him, and he does this. I'll never forget it. He does, "Let me help you out." And he spends about the next 5 minutes telling him why a white man should never tell a black man that he's articulate. And if you're a white person in the room and you don't know why you shouldn't tell a black person why they're articulate, go ask somebody after we're done today. All right? In love. Because we need to have grace when it comes to race. Because here's what happens. I know this. We live in a hyper-offended culture, but we shouldn't live in a hyper-offended church. We will never see oneness. We will never see reconciliation if we're always walking around on eggshells and we're perpetually taking one step forward and two steps back because we crucify people when they get it wrong. And so what happens is when we crucify the people who are trying to get it right, but they get it wrong, they retreat back in their shells. And so pulpits stop talking about it because they're afraid it's going to hit social media and they'll get ruined for it. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. What if instead of looking for reasons to be offended, we were actually walked around looking for reasons to forgive? What if we looked around looking for ways to give love, to be known by our love again? Not carrying around the chips, but actually sharing the chips and saying, this may come off wrong, but I want to be healed. Like, I want to learn how do I say this right? How can we actually be one? I've always wanted to ask somebody this, and I'm probably going to say it's stupid, and it's going to sound wrong, but can you give me grace in the area of race? Because we got to be one. We got to be one. I was in a staff meeting, actually this Tuesday, and I was talking about this moment right here, and I said, hey, guys, I'm going to be there at the 400Conference, and we're going to be commemorating, we're going to be remembering the 400-year anniversary, get this, of slaves being brought to America. And right afterwards, one of my staff pastors came up and he said, he's like, hey, I know you didn't mean to say it like you say it, but slaves weren't brought to America. I said, what do you mean? He said, human beings were brought to America. And men were brought to America, and women were brought to America, and mothers were brought to America, and fathers were brought to America, and doctors were brought to America, and engineers were brought to America. Human beings were brought here, and then they were forced into a life of slavery, and their dignity was removed. And I just looked at him, and you know what I said? I said, thank you. Because I've never thought about it that way, but you're 100% right. But we can never have those conversations if we don't have grace when it comes to race. We have to be willing to seek to understand rather than demanding to be understood, and we have to enter into people's stories. Because I believe this, and I'll end with this, is that when we don't live that way, here's what we're saying, is that when we're divided, we're telling the world that the blood of Jesus is enough to save us, but it's not enough to unite us. The blood of Jesus can wash away my sins, but it can't wash away my prejudice. The blood of Jesus can reconcile me to the Father, but it can't reconcile me to you. And I categorically reject that lie. I reject that lie, and I pray we all do. Why? Because we are so much better together than we are apart. And I believe that unity is worth fighting for. So let's change the story. Amen. God bless you.